This is a Dynamics 365 podcast, focusing on the ingredients of a successful Dynamics 365 practice. Your host is Business Solution MVP Mark Smith, otherwise known as the NZ365 Guy. For more information on this interview, show notes, feedback, and resources mentioned, or to suggest a guest for future episodes, please go to nz365guy.com/podcast. Thanks to CRM UG for sponsoring the Dynamics 365 Practice podcast. Dynamics 365 UG and CRM UG is the world's most influential user group community of Microsoft Dynamics 365 and CRM users and partners. Across the globe, members share the common goal of maximizing and advancing the performance of Microsoft Dynamics 365 and CRM so that individuals and companies can improve operations, overcome obstacles, and exceed goals. Hi everyone, I'm here with Neil Benson. In this episode, we're going to be focusing on implementation methodologies in the Dynamics 365 practice. Neil has 10 years experience starting and leading successful customer engagement practices in the UK, US, and Australia. With 15 years experience, he is a specialist at winning, envisioning, and delivering CRM projects that provide clients with amazing results. He has been practicing Agile CRM software implementation using some Scrum since 2009, and is certified by both the Scrum Alliance and Scrum.org, and has published online courses on Scrum for Microsoft Dynamics 365. Neil has received the Microsoft MVP Award for Business Solutions since 2010 for his contribution to the CRM community. He has spoken at numerous user groups, conferences, and has published 2 CRM books. Neil, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Mark. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've been listening along to your podcast series for the last couple of months, and it's a real honor to join the reputable gang you've assembled for your Dynamics practice series.
Excellent. Thank you. So, Neil, I've known you for some years, for your MVP years. Can you share with me about how you got into Dynamics, what's your journey been thus far?
Yes, I started my career about 20 years ago, about 5 years before I got involved in CRM. I was a sales guy, and I was always the one who was whining about the CRM system. We had a contact form. It must have had 12 required fields, something like that, and people would just put anything in the fields to get the contact form saved. I got kicked into the IT department to go and sort it out, and that was my first experience. It's like, what job do you call this? Oh, it's a CRM business analyst. Wow, I want to do more of this. And a few years later, I found myself working as a CRM business analyst for Rackspace, the hosting company. The project ran between London and Texas, so I was flying backwards and forwards. And I loved their fanatical support for hosted servers, and I really wanted to apply that to CRM software. So I was pretty naive. I just called up Sage and Salesforce and Microsoft and said, hey, how can I host your software? And that led to a Microsoft CRM hosting company. I started in 2006. I grew that and sold it in 2009. And then I ran the customer engagement team at Slalom Consulting in California. And now I'm doing the same thing at KPMG in Australia.
Awesome. Excellent. What a great career thus far. So one of the things that I'd like to focus on in this episode is implementation methodologies and your experience with them, specifically on how they apply to Dynamics 365. Can you give me an overview of the different methodologies you've used on projects across your career and what you're using now?
Sure. I don't think my early projects probably didn't really follow any particular methodology, nothing formal. They were sequential and plan driven. So today we probably call those a waterfall project. We pretended it was possible to know all the requirements and schedule every task up front at the start of the project before you'd actually delivered any software. And I was one of the first people to deploy Dynamics CRM using Surestep. It was a project at the BBC in London, working alongside Microsoft Consulting Services, just as they were rolling out Surestep. That was back in about 2006. Later in 2009, I was implementing CRM for Premier Medical Group in London. After, the requirements phase must have been about 6 weeks long. We delivered a huge requirement specification, and Debbie, the operations director, told me that she wasn't sure if that was complete or accurate. I don't think, looking back on it now, I don't think any requirement specification in the history of software has ever been complete or accurate. There's always gaps in it. There's always inaccuracies and ambiguities. But Debbie was the first project sponsor to ever call me on it, and she refused to sign it. She didn't want to rely on a 400-page document that nobody really understood, so she didn't want to wait a year and a half to get any working software. She wanted prototypes along the way. And I'd read, I hadn't much experience, but I'd read an article about Scrum. So I pitched it to Debbie. She loved it. We pitched it to her board of directors, and they went for it. Having no experience with it, I had to find some help. And I teamed up with Cyber UK, and we implemented CRM with Scrum, and it went really well. A year and a half, we did dozens of releases into production, and Premier Medical Group actually ended up getting acquired by Capita, and one of the reasons cited was the quality of their software platform that we had built. So, given the choice, I've probably used Scrum on every project since then. And like you said at the top, I've got a couple of certifications in that, and I'm delivering Scrum for Dynamics 365 courses. Guess I'm on a mission to ensure that every Microsoft partner and customer uses Scrum or some other Agile methodology to deploy Dynamics.
Brilliant. So that's interesting. So what do you see as the power of Agile in Dynamics 365 projects, particularly on, if you like, the waterfall approaches that have been available in the past?
So the main difference for me is a couple of things. It's much more fun for the people involved because we're allowed to use our intelligence to solve the problems that are immediately in front of us, rather than a typical project where there's an architect who comes in and does all the design up front. And that person's maybe read the requirements spec or been involved in the requirements sessions, gets to design everything, and then the rest of us are just expected to implement it. With Scrum, we work as a team together. There might still be an architect on that team, but we all have a hand to play in requirements analysis, design, development, and deployment. So I really like that team effort, that team approach. And we work at a sustainable pace, which some of my teams have kept up for a year or two or three on a project, which is much more challenging if it's a traditional approach. And we just deliver better quality software. The users are much more involved. They tend to get more of what they need rather than what we thought they needed. We can respond to their feedback, and we can deliver value really early.
So it's interesting, but in my experience, one of the challenges I'd run into with using Scrum as a methodology for projects, particularly with government agencies, they typically put out an RFP type process, and you come in with a price, and the price is a point valued system as part of the overall project. And how do you deal with that type of scenario in providing, if you like, cost estimations for an Agile project?
So I wouldn't say I have a technique, but I do have a technique that I have learned from others, particularly based on Mike Collins' Agile Estimating and Planning book and his approach. So I can pretty easily take a high-level requirement spec, convert the requirements into what I call epic user stories, estimate those, and plan that out. And later we'll prioritize those and schedule those. But I use a points-based estimate, and then figure out, if I have a team of 4 or 5 people, what kind of velocity they could go at, which is how many sprints they could tackle. Sorry, how many points worth of value they can deliver in each sprint, and therefore how long the project is going to take and how much it's going to cost. I can get estimates really quickly. Given a requirement spec, you can get an estimate done in a couple of hours as a team, and then slot that into your RFP. I do find that in those public sector RFP, they tend to prefer a traditional approach. I normally respond saying we don't do that anymore. It's Agile, or you can pick somebody else.
Yeah. Okay. And similar to my experience. We've got a question here from Andre, and he's asking, how do you decide the right methodology for implementation, Agile, Waterfall, or a hybrid? What's your view on that?
Okay, so you're asking an Agile fanatic what methodology you use. Thanks, Andre. I tend to use Scrum, and I haven't recommended using a traditional approach to any client for many years. That's my preferred approach. Now, Scrum is a framework. It's not a methodology. So the difference is that it's got some rules that you have to follow, but it's not a complete methodology. There are other practices you'll have to design yourself and add to your Scrum framework in order for it to be considered a complete methodology. So there's other stuff that I do in addition to Scrum, but I start there as a baseline.
Excellent. So can you give us a bit of insight into what are the other things that you bolt on, if you like, around the Scrum Agile framework?
Yeah, sure. So a really common one is to use user stories for defining requirements. Scrum doesn't say that you have to use user stories. In fact, it's pretty vague on how you manage how you manage requirements. But the use of user stories is very common among Scrum teams. So my teams have built up a good knowledge of how to use user stories and other types of product backlog items. So bugs, epics, chores, and spikes would be pretty commonly used across many teams in Scrum, and those are the kind of practices we had. Scrum's also got very little to say about risk management, so we have to add on some risk management practices to be able to cope with project risks as well.
Excellent. Anything else?
How you deploy the software, how you release it, how you bundle it up into solutions. So there's some technical stuff that we obviously have to do for Dynamics as well. So we've got approaches to those things so that we have a repeatable methodology that's not just a loose framework.
We have a question here from Andrew, and he's asking about implementation approaches when you're doing a version upgrade. So let's say you're going from Dynamics, let's say 2013, Serum 2013 to Dynamics 365. What do you do? Do you just do a like-for-like enhancements, or do you have a specific approach around how you would do an upgrade like that?
Nothing particularly special. I don't know, Mark, if you've ever done one of those multi-version upgrade projects. I don't really think I have. I've done lots of upgrades within a project. So American Homes for Rent, during the course of that project, which was about 2 years, we did a Serum, almost been Serum Online 2011 to 2013 upgrade, and they're now on 365. My current client is a university in Australia. We've upgraded them from 2016 Online to 365, or what we now know is 8.2. And we just do that as part of our natural project rhythm. The version becomes available. We estimate when we're going to do the upgrade. We upgrade our. We typically pick one of not the development instance and not the production instance, one of the other instances. We normally have about 4 or 5 on a project. Upgrade one of those, run through a set of regression tests, see how it went, maybe have to fix a few things, and then build in those fixes into our sprint plan, and off we go. Have you ever done one of those big multi-version upgrades? And is it much different?
The one that I was involved in some years back was for Rabobank, and that was an on-premise environment. Going through, I think we did a 2-version jump on that one from memory. But yeah, similar to that, I just see the latest stuff coming out from Microsoft around, deploying your machine jumps in Azure and doing your migration through the versions up. There's a lot of work involved, but there's definitely a method there around doing it.
Yeah, so I think the big decision there is, are you so far out of date that you may as well just do a complete rip and replace, start again, get rid of all the features that you're no longer using, update all the business processes you haven't updated in a few years, and use Dynamics 365 Online and just migrate your data. That's the big decision. So
common pitfalls of certain methodologies and lessons learned was a question from Andre. What have you come across there?
So I talked a little bit about using Surestep at the BBC. We ran that requirements exercise 3 times, not through choice, but just to get to a decent requirement specification. I just struggle with those requirement specs. I read them and know that you see duplicate requirements all the time, and those get doubly estimated. You see ambiguity in English language, which is really hard for you and I both to have a common understanding about the requirement when all we've done is communicate in an Excel spreadsheet. Especially in a tender situation where I've got no chance to give you a call and ask you, exactly what you meant. So I tend to try and avoid those things these days. Having said that, Scrum's got some pitfalls as well. I've struggled on projects to get the right product owner. So typically I'm the Microsoft partner. My client is going to provide the product owner. That person's got to be pretty senior. They've got to be good at making decisions. They've got to know the business really well, and they've got to be available. Finding somebody with all of those qualities is really tough. But getting the wrong product owner, or getting two people as the product owner who don't always agree with each other has been a challenge on a couple of my projects. We talked about the importance of estimating and planning Agile projects. That's a really different approach from Waterfall. So understanding how to do that and getting that right. And then acting on the user feedback and making your backlog visible and transparent. So I find if we do that, then users know what's coming down the line, they know roughly when each feature is going to be delivered, and they're pretty comfortable then. One of the things I still struggle with is users prioritize everything as, have to have it top priority, because their experience is that there's never a phase 2. Phase 1 always takes so long, goes over budget, that there's, phase 2 gets written off and the user doesn't get anything that was, medium priority. With Scrum, we deliver, a release to production really early, and we try and reassure them that there's going to be multiple releases throughout the course of the project. And so they are going to get what they want if they can afford it and justify it.
Yeah, exactly. So interesting question here, and it's been asked, I suppose, by a lot of people, or I've heard it a lot over the years, and this one's come from Joel, and he says, in your opinion, can fixed fee delivery work in a Dynamics 365 project?
Yeah, I'd be interested to see your perspective on this as well, Mark. I wrote a blog article on it a few months ago. I often get asked in RFPs especially to provide a fixed price fee approach. It can be done, yeah, definitely. We can use our Agile techniques to estimate and plan those and fix our fees around that. At the end of the day, the customer's product owner gets to reprioritize the product backlog every sprint. So that means they effectively are in control of the scope. So I can fix the fees, but I can't tell you exactly what we're going to deliver within the project, because the customer's in control of the requirements. So if they're happy with that, absolutely, we can fix the fees, and I can tell you roughly what we can deliver, but it's really up to the customer then to control it. Some customers are terrified of that approach. Others realize that it puts the power back in their hands, and they're really happy with it.
Just for the listeners, Neil's mentioned a few books and blog posts, etc. of his. I'll make sure those are in the show notes so you can click through to them once you finish listening here. But Neil, I want to go on now and look at and really deconstruct Microsoft Dynamics Surestep. So we have another question here from Andrew. How relevant is Surestep in today's climate? I kind of want to hear what you have to say, no holds barred, on Dynamics Surestep. So Surestep, when did it come out? 2006, 2007, something like that. It was really good back then. There was lots of Microsoft partners getting into Dynamics that needed a methodology. Microsoft came up with Surestep, and it gave them something really solid to follow. I think really big kind of global consultancies struggled with it, either because they had their own methodology or they wanted a methodology that went across multiple products. So they might have also offered other CRM projects and products, and obviously Surestep's designed just to work with Microsoft Dynamics. I thought the fact that it covered all the Dynamics products, it had lots of great templates, a great set of role descriptions, a great set of phase descriptions. I thought it was pretty solid, and I used it in a couple of projects back then. But it didn't get updated very much to cope with the shift towards Agile frameworks that people have been asking for. There was an Agile version of it, but it really just said, write all the requirements up front and then do iterative delivery, which is a hybrid approach that I think sucks because it's the worst of both worlds. But right now, I think Surestep's dead, and if you don't believe me, you're going to have to install Silverlight on your computer to get access to it. So Surestep is as thriving as Silverlight. Yeah, it's interesting is that I use Surestep a few times to do, if you like, after project completed, like use the estimator to see I knew what the cost of the project was to deliver. and then use their estimators and things. And I was hard pressed to ever get it to be 3 times the cost of what I delivered the project for. So it's kind of like it would, if you use the estimators within it, it would potentially price you always out of the park when trying to deliver a project. So, but you're right, the templates are fantastic.
Especially if you want to use MCS fee rates.
Exactly. If you've done any MCS work, you often find that they'll often send those templates to you that they want your responses in them. It's it's definitely still obviously being used in some sectors. One of the questions here from Mohammed is, what's the difference between Microsoft Dynamics Surestep and Microsoft Lifecycle services in your view?
I'm not really that familiar with Lifecycle services. My ERP teams still use it. As far as I know, it's really only for AX 2012 R2 and R3. I don't even know if it's been updated for Dynamics 365 for finance and operations. But I don't think it's ever been expanded to handle CRM projects, so I haven't used it much. It's somewhere where you can store your business process models, your requirements, and come together as a team to share those and collaborate. So that's my understanding of it. I could be wrong, but I've never had the opportunity to use it. I've never worked on an ERP project.
Yeah, they definitely were looking at putting Dynamics, the CRM component, if you like, inside it. I played with it maybe 2 years ago, had an environment, etc. And I knew Surestep was kind of like embedded into that to some degree, as in a methodology that was available that you could use. And what I've seen around some of the systems upgrades, if you're going to do multiple version of Dynamics jumps, that it's recommended, but to my knowledge, it's never come into production, the whole CRM 365 from a customer engagement point of view. So no. Another question he asks here is, can you use Microsoft Lifecycle services for Dynamics 365 deployments as you can for operations? And at this point, to my knowledge, the answer is no. Would you agree?
Yeah, I haven't seen it used by any CRM teams. I'm interested to hear that you explored it. It must have been some kind of beta project with Microsoft, but yeah, I've never seen it rolled out.
So another question here from Nadija, and his one is, what are the techniques you found most successful to map business processes you get from customers?
I haven't done any hardcore business process modeling for a while. I did get into the business process modeling notation, BPMN 2.0, just to give me some structure around that. And I found that really useful. I've seen lots of workflow diagrams with no structure, no consistent use of the different shapes. So people use a diamond as a decision, but think that you can only have 2 lines coming out of it. Well, what happens if there's 3 different options? Oh no. They've used rectangles for decision gateways, all sorts of crazy stuff. So many years ago, I used a technique called Riva from Martin Old's book. It was great, very thorough in a theoretical sense, but I found that the models were pretty hard for people to read. They have to go and read a book before they could read your business process flow. That's not ideal. BPMN gives you all the rigor that you would expect of a full methodology. I don't think Martin Old quite likes it as much as from a theoretical point of view, but I find the charts are very readable. They just look like swim lane diagrams, except that they're consistent and repeatable, and you can actually test them. You can click a button in Visio or whatever, and it'll say, yep, your model hangs together really well. It upholds all the rules of BPMN. So those are pretty good.
So have you used the XRM Metadata tool for Dynamics 365 from the XRM toolbox? Have you found it useful for redundant entity analysis? So probably more in an upgrade scenario, I would expect. This one came from Prash. Have you used that tool at all? Found it effective?
Yeah, I haven't used a lot of the XRM toolbox for a little while. My teams use it every day. There's a couple of good tools in there, yes, for how many times is it, how many records are there of this type of entity? That can be really useful. You can also do things like which fields are used most commonly and which fields are never used at all, to give you. It's one of those good tools you might use for picking up a project halfway through. If somebody else has had a crack at it, then you want to know how far they've got. Or like I said, you're doing an upgrade and you want to figure out which parts of the system are already used.
So another question here from Nadija is, what is the best way to categorize work items and tasks to be completed by team members for features, and really looking at it from that Agile lens? What's your opinion on that?
So I have 5 different types of product backlog item in my projects. First one is an epic. An epic is really just a big requirement that's so big we can't implement it within one sprint, which is normally a 2 or 3 week period. So epics are used to give us that high level overview. And if we know all of the epics for a project, then that defines our scope at a pretty high level. We break epics down, we refine those into user stories. And that process of refinement is a little bit, I don't know if you ever played Asteroids, Mark, as a kid. You've got the little spaceship in the middle of the screen and these big rocks swirling around you. Well, if you break up all of the big rocks into little rocks, you're going to get crushed, right? Because there's so many little rocks flying around that you're going to get smacked by something that came from behind you. Refining epics into user stories is a little bit like that. We don't refine all of them immediately. We do it just in time. So just as we're about to start the next epic, we'll refine it down into smaller, more implementable user stories. And some of those can be implemented in an hour or two. Others are going to take a couple of days. And a user story, there's a pretty well-trodden template for it. You can use that. That defines who's got the requirement, who's going to get value out of it, what the feature is, and what the value of that feature is. So it just gives us a nice reminder about why we're doing it. Underneath that, we then break it down and describe the requirement in a little bit more detail. We can have acceptance criteria for it. So those are my user stories. We typically have dozens, hundreds, thousands of those on a project. Track all of those in a requirements management system. And as well as that, we have spikes. A spike is a little bit of research, maybe to answer a question about which document generation tool should we use. So we'll go off and do a little bit of evaluation of the different options. So a spike is there to answer a question. It comes from the idea of mountain climbing. So you drive a spike into the wall of the mountain that stops you falling too far if you slip. So that's the idea behind that. Reduce your risk. We have chores. So a chore is anything the team needs to do, a bit of work. So upgrade a server or deploy a new instance for doing rehearsals into production or something like that. And what else do we have? Defects. Yeah, I don't really get many of those in my projects, but you might find them useful in some of yours. So bugs and defects coming out of production.
So just around that process, how do you make sure that the design or the user experience is factored in as part of your process?
Do you mean from a user interface design? And just
So for example, you can have, let's say, a requirement that a field needs to be on a form that captures a piece of data, but it could be put in just the totally wrong place from a user experience perspective. But if you like, it validates against the user acceptance test. Unless, in your user acceptance testing, do you have a UX component in that?
Probably not as an acceptance criteria. I try not to ask users to specify where stuff should go. That's a design decision I leave up to the team implementing it. But I encourage my team members to go back and show the product owner or the user before the end of the sprint, hey, here's where it has gone on the form. I haven't run any of my tests yet, but here's how the view looks, or here's how the chart looks. Do you have any quick feedback that I can still incorporate into my story this sprint before I consider it to be done? But that only optimizes around a single feature, right? Of your field on the form or your chart. We quite often have to go into maybe a user experience story itself to say, let's optimize the layout of the contact form. and that will be a story in its own right. And in that case, we'll do some wireframing to come up with the acceptance criteria and say that when the form looks like this, then it'll be done.
So the next question, and I've come across this, and I'm sure you have many times from Prash, is around what's the best practice when taking over a project midway through with incomplete documentation? So in other words, you've got a hospital pass for whatever reason. How do you handle that?
There's a couple of tools I've used to, we talked about some of them in the XRM toolbox. I really like Mitch Milam's documentation generator, Snapshot. Right? So we've got a global partner license for that. So all of our consultants worldwide can use it for any of our clients' projects. And we run that really just to get a sense of what kind of customization has been done. So if there's lots of entities called new underscore, then you know you've got a real hospital pass on your hands, and trying to figure out what's been done. And then it's just some good interviews with the users to figure out what features they like and what features they don't like. The challenge there is some of them might be pretty embittered towards Dynamics and want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, meaning the project didn't go so well and they think it's the software's fault. It very rarely is the software's fault, and the challenge is trying to get them back on side, build up their motivation, as well as having them express their requirements and prioritize those.
I consulted on a major project for federal government in Australia that was at the end of delivery after 2 to 3 years, and there were many embittered people about it and what they were blaming the software for. It took a very short amount of time to prove that it had nothing to do with the software. It had a bit to do with the way it was configured and designed. We have a question here from Andre, and it's around what are the tools that you use, or what do you find is best practice when it comes from tool sets to manage implementations? For example, Visual Studio, Jira, that type of thing.
Yep. So I'm currently using both of those on different projects. I'm using Jira because it's a client's preference. They run all their projects in Jira, and Jira's fine. You need to configure parts of it to work. My beef with Jira is Jira calls everything an issue. And my life's got enough issues in it. You can ask my wife. It's okay. The user interface needs some work, but we use Jira pretty successfully in some pretty large projects with 20 or 30 people involved. Given if a client doesn't have a preference, maybe it's a smaller project or they're not using Jira, then we'll probably use Visual Studio Team Services. It's got a couple of new features in it that I really like. One that I had to use another system called Pivotal Tracker from, which came out of Pivotal Labs, a big Agile shop. So it had a really nice feature that you just organized your backlog, estimated your stories, told it what you expected your velocity to be and what date you were going to start your project, and then it just forecast everything for you. So you knew exactly what date everything would be finished. Great for proposals. I used it. I pump all that into Pivotal Tracker, get all the dates sorted out, export that, and then include that in a proposal or some kind of project timeline for somebody. Visual Studio now has that feature, and you can do the same. It takes a bit of fiddling to get your velocity right. I'm not quite sure how they're calculating what happens to a user story that can't be completed in a sprint, whether it gets pushed forward or backwards. But it's a really nice kind of forecast velocity feature.
One of the questions I have around, particularly Visual Studio, is often I'd have customers that would want to host the Visual Studio environment on their side of the arrangement, and I always would prefer to host it on my side, because if I'm responsible for what's in there, I don't want some person in their admin or IT department to lose stuff, so to speak. And so ultimately ended up creating an environment where we would host, but then had a feed through to their system as well that would update theirs. What have you found worked in that scenario?
Yeah, I've only ever had those discussions a couple of times with customers. I don't really mind. I don't have strong opinions on it like you do. Right now, I tend to use Visual Studio Team Services, the online version of that Microsoft hosts. in the past, and that's got some benefits. So everybody who's got an MSDN license, for example, which isn't all of my team, they all get free access to it. You get 5 free customer licenses and unlimited reader licenses, so it's really inexpensive for people to use it. Jira, I'm currently using, KPMG can host it, our customers can host it, and one customer does host it, or you can use it hosted by Atlassian, the vendor. I have no strong feelings whether that's who hosts it and whether that's a good or bad idea. I've never had a customer lose the entire repository. It sounds like you've had some experience with that.
We have another question here. This one's from Peter, and he said, what is best practice have you seen around change management and overcoming user resistance as part of a project?
I'm pretty lucky. I've never faced massive user resistance, and I think a couple of things help there. And I'm not a change management practitioner. We have 400 or 500 of those experts in Australia, so I definitely involve them in my projects. A couple of customers right now, they have also got change management professionals involved in the project, and they do their thing. But from a Dynamics point of view, there's a couple of things we can do. Deliver software early and often, get the users involved in it, have the users give us their requirements, and we listen to those, prioritize those, and make the backlog visible, and have them test and get them, see the requirements coming down the pipeline pretty early. That really helps. Most of my team come from a user background, so I tend to really enjoy employing people who've been users of the software. So they're marketing professionals, they're salespeople, they're customer service managers who've become CRM consultants because they love the software so much and end up switching careers. They have a lot more empathy, I think, with users than some consultants who have been, computer science graduates, come straight into consulting and never used CRM software. So I think that makes a little difference as well.
Yeah, so that's interesting you bring up empathy, because my next question is around that. There's a blog post there that I'll reference from Mohammed that he did on LinkedIn around human-centered design and the consultative approach around it. And it really deals with empathy. And in my former role, I heavily rolled out, if you like, a hybrid of Agile and human-centered design, because I found it had a massive, if you like, it had an ability to take consultants that have, if you like, come from a more technical background and get them to empathize with the end user. Often a consultant will not remember or not think about the fact that a field left in the wrong place or a business process implemented poorly affects people for potentially months, if not years to come. And if that's not, if you like, thought out as part of that process, and if you like, where an empathy is created with those people, less than optimal implementations, is the outcome of that. Have you come across human-centered design? Are you using it, using design thinking in any part of your projects?
Not in a formal sense. It's definitely something I'd like to explore further. So thanks for that recommendation. I'm a guest on your podcast and learning just as much as I hope I'm sharing. But I think maybe naturally my approach, because I use the software every day. At KPMG, we've got 5,000 users on it, and I see things that I just wish somebody had asked the users if they like it and if they enjoy it, if it's working the right way for them. You can see that they haven't, and you're right. Those are little bits of grit that just get in the way of my enjoyment of the software, and it'll be like that for months and years to come, because they're probably not going to get fixed. They're not high enough priority that it's worth investing in fixing them, but in total, they just drag down your enjoyment of the software.
We've got last question from a guest here, Anton, and he is asking, what would you consider to be the main drivers of methodology choice? For example, would any of these factors inform your choice? The project size, public versus private, as in company being worked for, the industry, the organization size, the client organization approach to or experience level to change management?
I really I stick with the one methodology that we've got. I'll tailor it slightly for different customers based on different factors, like Anton has mentioned. The one struggle I have is, like I said earlier, the customers who don't have an experienced, available senior product owner, and that's been tough on a couple of projects recently and in the past. And I'm not sure that Scrum was the best approach in those situations, but I'm also not sure that a traditional sequential approach would have been the best either. I think those projects, it shows a customer who's maybe not ready for a relatively transformational technology project. If they haven't got that person in place, that customer would have been better off maybe just saving their money and not deploying new software right now if they haven't got a leader of that project. And I would have been better as a consultant saying exactly that, just saying, save your money, don't employ us, maybe don't employ anybody at all. Maybe Mark Smith could do a much better job than we could, since you haven't got somebody in place to run it. But I should have walked away from those projects rather than try and get engaged and try and be the hero and try and build a team that can deliver a successful software project in a vacuum where there's no leadership on the customer side.
So another question I have is around, so would you typically be running a project with stand-ups, to start each day?
Yeah. So at the moment I participate in 3 or 4 stand-ups. It's trying to get us, they're short 15-minute meetings where the team checks in to make sure that we all understand what everybody's going to be working on today. And we do those every day on all of our projects. I don't participate in all of them, but my teams definitely do them. They're much easier to do in person. Like most of Scrum's events, they're very hard to participate in remotely. So my teams all meet physically where possible to do those, normally in the customers' offices. And we run those.
So you actually led into what my second question, or the backup question for this is what about the scenarios where you've got team members involved that just can't be on the project? So, for example, I've had a project that was being run out of Brisbane in Australia, but 3 of the key people involved in the project were based in London. And so you had a time zone difference, yet there was still a need to have a consistent, if you like, stand-up as part of that process. Have you come across that? How have you handled it?
So in your example, your team members were in London.
Yeah, three people in the project team were in London for the company we were working with that were involved in it. And, of course, that's a total time zone flip.
Yeah.
So we found, Skype video was one of the ways to, if you like, get the eyeballs in the room to some degree. But, of course, it was definitely not at the start of the day for everybody involved in the project. Some cases at the end of their day. So have you come across it? How would you handle it if you had to tackle a project that involved stakeholders that were in different time zones?
So lots of my projects have been remote. Think back to some of the work that I did in California. So in Southern California, at American Homes for Rent, we all lived within a few, probably 50 or 60 kilometers of the customer's location. But in California time, that meant like a 3 or 4 hour drive in the traffic. So we all worked remotely. We visited the customer probably once a week, not all at the same time. But we needed to get some face time with the customer. So whether that's an international project across time zones, bring the project team together as often as you can afford. And it can be expensive, but make sure you get that real person connection as well, so that when you're on the phone, it's with somebody you've met, it's with somebody you know, it's with somebody you've been out to dinner with. It's somebody who's met the customer and some of the users. So that's really important. And then it doesn't really matter to me what time of day the stand-up is. It's got to be every day, whether that's the start or end of somebody else's day. That's not a huge issue. But like you say, I think video calls are much better at making sure that we can see some people and they can see the board, for example, if we're using a physical Scrum board.
I know that in a range of projects that we're running in Hong Kong is that we found for at least the first 3, often up to 6 weeks, would always bring the project team together, especially if it was a project that was going to run for, 9+ months. And it just created that kind of synergy that people had the eyeballing for that, period of time. Yes, there's an extra cost for it, but it definitely paid off in the success of the projects. So yeah, can't speak highly enough of getting your team together like that. I've got a couple just quick fire questions as we draw to a close now. What books do you recommend to people, most to people, particularly in, from a Dynamics career perspective, and why?
So I've read hundreds of business books, and I read, try and read one every 2 or 3 weeks. A couple of business books I really like that are actually, one was on the list of Newsweek's top 50 or top 100 business books, and it was the first business book I'd read that was a novel, which is a really hard type of book to write. That's called The Goal by I think Ellie Goldratt is the author. Another one's called The Phoenix Project, which is about DevOps in IT, and both of those are pretty good. The Goal is about the theory of constraints in manufacturing, and The Phoenix Project is about DevOps. And they're both novels. They're quite enjoyable. They're not award-winning pieces of fiction, but they stand out in my mind because they have real characters and they introduce you to a storyline and teach you some concepts along the way as well.
What's your favorite app and why?
I use quite a few. I don't know if one stands out. So I use Money Brilliant every day. I'm a big fan of personal finance and use that every day. I use Duolingo every day for learning a little bit of Danish. So my wife's parents are Danish.
Why Danish?
My wife's parents are Danish, and she spoke Danish growing up at home here in Australia. So I was around there for dinner last night. I can understand what they're saying, but I'm not yet confident enough to try and join in. I don't know if I should tell them I know what they're saying. I use Sleep Cycle for getting up early. So Sleep Cycle is really good. It wakes you up whenever you're sleeping lightly, so you don't get woken up in the middle of a deep sleep like a normal alarm might. I've got a couple of thousand usernames and passwords stored in LastPass, which I use everywhere, and I listen to your podcast on an app called Overcast, which is really nice. So Overcast has this smart speed playback feature. So depending on how fast the speakers are talking, it'll adjust the speed from 1.1 to 3 or 4 times normal speed, which helps me get through all of Joel Lindstrom's podcasts pretty quickly. But it makes George Dubinsky sound like a chipmunk.
Do you have any daily rituals that kind of set you on the right path for a successful day?
I try to practice. A few years ago, I read a book called The Miracle Morning, and I try to practice that. The guy called Hal Elrod. So it involves, I think there's 6 parts to it. So you wake up an hour early and practice 10 minutes of 6 rituals. So meditate, read, write, affirmation, visualization, and exercise. My exercise is a little bit of yoga and some stretches and a little bit of cardiovascular stuff.
Interesting. Tell me about the meditation. Are you using an app like, I can't even think. I've been using it for some weeks now, and it's just lost me in my mind. Headspace is the one I use. Do you use any app, or if you just do it self-directed?
I've tried a couple. I've tried Calm and Headspace. They're both really good, but they're both paid apps, and there's tons of free meditation apps out there. The one I use is called One Giant Mind, and it's pretty simple. So number 1, and then Giant Mind, and it's got I think there's a 30-day program, there's a 12-step program, and then there's a daily version as well. And you can get to learn how to meditate, and then practice your meditation with that every day. Yeah. So I just do 10 minutes, and even if I'm flying, I find that as soon as they say we're about to land, I can squeeze in 10 minutes of meditation as we're about to land and set myself up right for the day.
What recommendation do you have for people wanting a successful career in Dynamics?
If you're new, maybe if you're a graduate or you've got not a lot of career experience, then there's lots of new areas of Dynamics that old farts like Mark and I probably don't know that well. So get involved in Flow and Power Apps. I've deployed on projects, but personally I haven't been that hands-on in those. They've actually been configured and set up by some of the new grads in my team who pick this stuff up really quickly. So get involved in some of those things that are new to the platform. And you can build a name for yourself that way. I guess if you're more experienced and maybe coming across from another product, try and get certified pretty quickly and bring some of your experience from other products to bear on your projects, but don't mention them too much. I know one consultant said, "Oh, gold mine this and gold mine that and gold mine the other." Well, we haven't done any gold mine work for 10 years, and you're not going to be doing any more ever again. So, thanks for those ideas, but let's move on.
If you could redo anything in your career, what would it be?
I don't know. You can only tackle each day as it comes. I don't have a huge grand plan for my career. I never have. I got laid off, and that sparked me set up my own business. It seemed like a disaster at the time, but I set up my own business, and that was an immense adventure. That was really good fun. Looking back, I wish I could be kinder and more generous, but that applies to life in general, not just my career.
Who do you recommend as a guest for the podcast in the future?
I guess other people have probably recommended Satya. That would be awesome. Or James Phillips, something like that. I tell you what would be interesting. Your series is obviously focusing on best practices around running a dynamics consultancy. It'd be great to hear a customer's perspective and what they think of different types of Microsoft partners and the different behaviors that great partners exhibit from a customer's perspective. So maybe get you one of your old customers, or I'd be happy to do that with one of mine. See if they'll come on and share their perspective.
Neil, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show. Before you go, if people want to follow you online, where can they find you?
I'm on LinkedIn, Neil Benson. So it's linkedin.com/in/Neil Benson. I'm on Twitter at Customary. That's the word customer with a Y on the end. And you can visit my website and blog and sign up for a free Scrum Dynamics training course on customary.com.
This has been a Dynamics 365 podcast focusing on the ingredients of a successful Dynamics 365 practice. Your host was Business Solution MVP Mark Smith, otherwise known as NZ365 Guy. For more information on this interview, show notes, feedback, and resources mentioned, or if you know someone who would be a great guest for future episodes, please go to nz365guy.com/podcast.